everyone. Welcome to Sierra Nevada Alliance's June webinar. My name is Jennifer Marshall, and I'm the Alliance's Development and Community Engagement Director. I'm so happy that all of you could make it here today. We're pleased to have Lucas Clay, PhD candidate with Clemson University, here to speak about carbon markets. But before he does, Taylor Parker, our Forestry Program Director, is going to say a few words about the Alliance's Forestry Program and share a bit about our relationship with Lucas and our interest in carbon markets. So I'm going to turn it over to Taylor.
Thank you, Jennifer. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining today. It's just incredible to see so many folks here to learn about and to talk about such an important topic. My name is Taylor, as Jen said. I am the Forestry Program Director, and I have the wonderful privilege of getting to work on forest health projects throughout the Sierra Nevada. Primarily, the Forest Program does this through our Sierra Corps Forestry Fellowship program. We have fellows throughout the Sierra Nevada range working on forest health projects, everything from going out to collect cones and seeds to growing up those little seeds and tons and millions of baby trees in nurseries for reforestations, working on reforestations, fuel load reduction projects, doing capacity building for our host sites throughout the Sierra Nevada, just some really remarkable work. And as Sierra Nevada Alliance leadership is thinking about how we can help the Sierra Nevada habitats, but also communities more and better, we are talking about ecosystem services and how we can empower and amplify the work of engaging with these ecosystem services. And in doing that, I reached out to a lot of my colleagues that I work with, and probably almost a year now, Lucas, we've been discussing this, and it just became so readily apparent to me that I don't think I'm the only one that's completely ignorant in carbon markets. So as we were talking, we realized, this could be a really amazing thing for everybody, even if, carbon markets don't end up being your thing or my thing or, our thing. It can start that conversation about ecosystem services and how we interact with our habitats in different ways. So I'm incredibly pleased and honored to have Lucas come and speak with us. He's somebody that I go to regularly and is just such a great educator and researcher, and also just an adventurer. Every time I talk to you, Lucas, you're always coming back from some through hike somewhere. I think recently it was Iceland, and when we met, you were hiking through the Rockies. So yeah, everything you bring to all the work that you do is so informed with what Gary Snyder calls that dirt work. So I appreciate all those things about you. So without further ado, Lucas, I'm so excited to learn from you and hear more about the work that you do and everything that you can share with us.
I'm glad to be here today. I got research in carbon markets, but also just kind of give an overview of kind of where these markets have been and how they can help both landowners and corporates, all the above, when it comes to that ecosystem services that you're talking about, Taylor, and when it comes to climate change mitigation and really having healthy forest management across the landscape. But as Taylor said, I'm a PhD candidate at Clemson University. I've been studying carbon cycling and carbon quantification in South Carolina forests and also South Carolina coastal ecosystems. And we've kind of, the carbon market has really grown in the last couple of years. And it's kind of fell in our lap. We've had to help landowners understand what are the options that they have when it comes to new sources of revenue, new markets, so that they can not only have sustainable forestry for years to come, but also make sure that they don't lose their forests to development, fire, and other disturbances. So without further ado, I'm going to give an overview of carbon markets. So we're going to talk about quite a few different things today. We're going to start by looking at why do we value carbon? And then we'll go into the history and current status of global carbon markets, the principles behind developing these projects, the organizational structure and protocols for the market itself, the future, and then I'll answer some FAQs and then further questions as well. So first off, we now can value carbon simply because of basic economics, this idea that there is supply and demand related to carbon now. On the demand side, there's the requirement or the desire for people or corporations or airlines to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. On the other side is the supply. So landowners, farmers, people that do carbon dioxide removal need incentives to draw down the greenhouse gases. So the carbon market really provides a mechanism for this to happen. It provides a way to value these carbon emission reductions and carbon sequestration, and a mechanism to sell and trade these credits to the buyers. So the reason we can do this with carbon and carbon as an ecosystem service is because carbon is everywhere. We can sequester carbon from the atmosphere in California and sell it as a credit in New York or vice versa. And also when we're talking about forestry projects, which primarily is what we're talking about today, is that these are natural climate solutions. So being able to manage forests in a way that is provide a healthy ecosystem is a natural climate solution with many co-benefits. So the carbon market process at the very highest level is very, very simple, where we're just selling these credits and the money is going back to the landowners, but there's a lot of nuances here. I wrote here voluntary market. We're going to talk about two different types of markets today. The voluntary market is simple in the sense of that we're going to sequester carbon. The landowners are going to sequester carbon and they're going to sell the carbon that they have sequestered in their forest to emitting corporations. So whether that be oil and gas or even just any type of corporation that is interested in reducing their emissions, they may be something that would purchase carbon offset credits. At that point, they would return that funding, pay for those credits back to the landowner as another source of revenue for that landowner. The other type of market we'll talk about today, since it is applicable, is the California compliance market. And this market, specifically for California industry, is a little bit more nuanced in that it is a cap and trade system. So in this system, we have, in this example, we have emitter A and B, and we have a cap on how many emissions that any industry that emits carbon emissions can release into the atmosphere. So in this example, emitter A is actually going to release additional greenhouse gas emissions above that cap. So they're going to actually have to purchase carbon credits from the carbon market to account for those emissions over the cap. Well, emitter B, they did not emit as many emissions up to the cap. So they can actually sell their allowances to the market so that the other emitter A can purchase those credits. What we're going to talk about mostly today is the offset credits that are coming into this market. While most of this market is made up of purchasing these allowances from different emitters, offset credits is up here and accounts for a small portion of the California compliance market. So what are offset credits? Offset credits are simply these reductions achieved by an outside activity from outside cap sectors. So just what I was saying, these are credits that can come from forest projects, whether that be in California or outside of California, and they're going to equal 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalents, just like an allowance would in the California compliance market. So because the compliance market is, like it says, it requires industries to purchase these credits. But when it comes to offset credits, these regulated entities can only use about 4 to 6% of their allowance obligation per compliance period to purchase credits. The rest of those credits per se have to come from purchasing from other industries. And you can see on the right here, there's a lot of different technology and on-the-ground measurement tools that we use to better understand how much carbon is in the forests. And we're going to talk about that when it comes to the principles of carbon projects. So we're going to start here kind of going back to the very beginning, and carbon markets have actually been around for a really long time, starting with the Kyoto Protocol back in the late 90s. And on this graph here, we'll see the y-axis is the degree of support for market mechanisms. And you can just see, just looking at that line, that the markets have ebbed and flowed significantly over the last 25 years. But what we see here, the Kyoto Protocol provided a mechanism to actually trade carbon as a commodity almost. And then the EU ETS, which is the European Union Emissions Trading System, really took off in the early 2000s and allowed for this trading and the development of these international protocols for forestry and reducing deforestation. With the financial crisis and the failure of the US federal cap and trade bill, the market did decline a little bit, but this is where the evolution of the voluntary carbon market began. So where we talk about the California compliance market as specifically for California regulated entities, the voluntary market is just that, where corporations can voluntarily purchase carbon offset credits to offset their emissions if they have net zero goals, for example. So over the last 10 to 15 years, that market has been slow to grow. But what we're seeing now is significant growth in both the voluntary and the compliance market because of the evolution of these net zero goals from a lot of corporations. So as I just said, we see relatively slow growth from 2005 to 2020 in the voluntary market. But in 2021, it grew considerably all the way up to about a $2 billion market by the value of traded carbon credits. And we expect this to grow significantly over the next 10 to 15 years. A lot of these goals associated with net zero end in 2030 or 2050, and many of these corporations are going to need these offset credits to reach their goals for carbon emissions reductions. Here's an example of really what's happening when we saw that increase in the traded value in 2021. So if you see 2021 on the x-axis here in this graph, we saw all of these types of credits. So we have removal credits and avoidance credits, renewable energy, and we'll talk about all these different types. But we saw all of these credits really kind of increase in price over the back end of 2021. There has been a decline. We'll talk about why that is, but we expect the market will ebb and flow. Some people are saying that they expect it to increase by a factor of at least 15 by 2030 and increase by a factor of 100 by 2050 for the size of this market. So to say all that, really this market is not going anywhere, and it's really important that we understand how both landowners and corporations can really effectively use this market for climate change mitigation. And that's really what it comes down to, is how do we use climate finance and conservation finance specifically within the carbon market mechanism to enhance these ecosystem services. So number one, really, this is a new market-based mechanism for conservation. It provides funding for conservation management through climate change resilience, forest management to increase forest health. So this is really important when it comes to fuel reduction for reducing wildfires, thinnings, and tree plantings as well. And also, even though we're really focused on carbon here in the carbon market itself, it really is creating a space for co-benefits. And when we say co-benefits, these are the other ecosystem services that we receive from the environment. So that would be things like increased wildlife and retaining soil on the landscape, increasing water quality, and ultimately helping with our biodiversity crisis as well. Secondly, carbon markets are channeling funding. They're helping move corporate and climate financing into natural climate solutions projects and increasing investments into landowners, nonprofits, and others who are doing the good work on the ground. So next, I'm going to talk about the principles behind the carbon offset projects. And these principles have been developed by various nonprofits and consulting agencies over the last 30 years to help us provide a framework to make sure that the credits really are what they say they are, that they're actually creating climate change mitigation, that they are reducing carbon, pulling it out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in trees or in soil, depending on the project type. So there are 6 major tenets of carbon projects. I'm going to talk about the 3 major ones today: additionality, permanence, and verification. If you're interested in carbon projects more, we can talk about leakage, real, and no double counting, but these really have a lot to do with the abstract international market, making sure that the credits are following scientific protocols and that they're only counted once. So first of all, additionality is this big idea that a new activity, or what we would call a carbon project on the ground in a forest, is implemented in the project area and that is different than business as usual. So business as usual is rather subjective when it comes to these projects, and it's really difficult to quantify. But when we consider business as usual, we're thinking a lot about common practice. So common practice for different areas of the country may be very different. Here in South Carolina, common practice is that we're growing loblolly pines on a 27-year rotation, for example, and that they're harvested very quickly and they grow very fast. This would be very different from a Rocky Mountains or Sierra Nevada type ecosystem where the rotation ages in these forests may be quite a bit longer, or depending on the forest type could be shorter. So the common practice of the business as usual would be very different. But what we do know is that depending on those business as usuals, a carbon project must do something different than that common practice. And this is where we get our additionality from. So, and also the payments for carbon credits must provide a financial incentive to the landowner or the organization to implement this new management that is going to sequester additional carbon. So if we look at this graph, we have on the y-axis, we have carbon sequestration, and on the x-axis, we have time. So over time, we're growing our trees to maximize timber. Most of the time, these projects, business as usual, is what is that number that will maximize our timber revenue? So if we're growing carbon and then we're harvesting, and we follow this gray line, we grow our carbon, we harvest. Let's say we want to implement a carbon project. One thing that we can do to have something that's different than business as usual would be to extend that rotation and then maybe not harvest as much, as you can see by the green line here. And then over the lifetime of the project, we may end up only harvesting once and opposed to twice with the maximizing timber baseline. And then anything in between these two lines, or any of the carbon sequestered here, would be what we call the additional carbon, and this can be sold as carbon credits. So this is just an example of how you would actually achieve additionality. Obviously, there would be a lot of nuance associated with the management of the forests when it comes to thinning and brush removal and other things. But this is the basic concept when it comes to making sure that the new activity is different than business as usual. The next major tenet is permanence. And permanence is this idea that we want to retain the carbon on the landscape forever. So this, once we sequester the carbon in the trees, we pull it out of the atmosphere, we want to make sure that it's not going to go back to the atmosphere anytime soon, or these corporations are going to have difficulty justifying these as actual offset credits. So this is really difficult. It's almost impossible to be able to quantify if the carbon is going to stay out of the atmosphere forever. But what we can do is we make protocols so that they're a long protocol, and we can capture this through 40 to 100 years. And we can get, at least for that amount of time, that carbon is going to stay in those trees or in the wood products from those trees. So another way that the protocols do this is they implement conservation easements or other types of easements to increase the durability, the permanence, which ultimately helps also increase the investor confidence in the project, which can, as you may assume, that this would help with the price of the credit as well. Another thing about permanence is this idea of buffer pools. And buffer pools account for unavoidable reversals in project areas. So project unavoidable reversals may be things like fire, severe weather. So in South Carolina, that may be something like hurricanes would destroy trees or projects. Avoidable reversals elsewhere. So this could be something like if the forest was cut down out of turn, or if they went back to their business as usual. But this usually would account for about 2 to 29% of the verified carbon credits on the property. So if you look at this picture here, we have the project area would be the amount of trees that are in your carbon project is the blue area. Part of that area between 2 to 29% is going to be the buffer pool. So those are verified carbon credits, but they cannot be sold, and they're saved essentially like an insurance policy if something were to go wrong in your project or in anybody else's project. The other major tenet is this idea of measurement and verification. So to be able to quantify the carbon and how much carbon is being sequestered over the lifetime of the project, measurements and cruises are done by a project developer every 5 to 6 years. So you can see here on the graph, you see how the trees are growing over time. On the blue arrow would be the beginning of the project, let's say, and you do an initial cruise and verification. So verification, not only are we going to have a project developer come out and do a cruise, but there's going to be a third-party verification company that would also make sure that everything is being done according to the requirements to make sure that the carbon is actually being sequestered. And then every 5 to 6 years, that same process would occur to show and quantify how much more additional carbon was sequestered in that project. And then ultimately that landowner and project developer could be paid for those credits once they're sold on the carbon market. So there's a bit of a hierarchy here when it comes to developing these projects, and there's a bunch of entities that are all involved before the credits can actually be sold to a corporation, for example. And that first one is going to be carbon project developers. Carbon project developers are typically for-profit forestry consultants or other startups that have been working specifically on these projects. So they have an understanding of the protocols and the registries, which we'll talk about. And then also they'll help with designing the management for these carbon projects so that the landowners can achieve additionality within these projects and also maintain permanence. So we're going to talk about some of the management options that you would have within the confines of the carbon market. So first and most common when it comes to forestry projects is going to be improved forest management, or IFM. So this is the idea of if our forest is unmanaged or managed in a not a very healthy way, we're going to improve that forest management because the objective is to increase carbon, and improved forest management typically leads to increasing carbon as well. So typically this will occur with harvesting. Sometimes there may be a desire to not harvest, but we do know within the protocol, the land must be viable for commercial harvest. And this has to do with the requirements for additionality and permanence. Also, broadcast fertilization cannot occur. These forests have to be enrolled in forest stewardship councils, sustainable forestry initiatives, or tree farm systems to show their sustainability. But basically the broad management practices that these projects can employ would increase mixed native species and increase the distribution of forest age classes through things like increased rotation ages, thinning diseased and suppressed trees, managing competing brush, increasing stocking, and maintaining stocking. So all of these things can be worked into a project together, or maybe it's already managed really well and you would just want to increase the rotation ages. It would very much depend on the forest type and the previous historical management. But again, going back to additionality, it's important to know that all these practices must be implemented due to the funding from selling these offset credits, and that's where we get the financial additionality component here. So again, this kind of just was back to my additionality example, just to reiterate, if this is our initial baseline where we are doing a pretty intensive growth and harvest, if we're going to add a carbon project, we may want to, in this example, we may extend the rotation just a little bit and then not harvest as much. And then because we didn't harvest as much, we could sell the rest of that carbon towards carbon credits, but also still harvest. The next project type is avoided conversion. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier in that graph where we saw the prices of the carbon credits. And what we're starting to see now is that there's been a deviation between how much different projects are receiving funding and the sale of these credits, I should say, where some projects are actually going to, because they're removing carbon, so improved forest management, you're going to have additional carbon on the landscape. Those credits are going to sell higher than something like an avoided conversion. It does not necessarily take away from the value of these avoided conversion credits, as I'll explain here. But when it comes to avoided conversion, this is the idea that we're paying landowners carbon credits to retain the carbon on their land because of imminent conversion. So let's say a developer comes to your land, you have you have 1,000 acres and they want to build an apartment complex on it. If you have a land appraisal that says that the land is suitable for conversion, or you have I have that letter in hand, that payment in hand, or almost in hand, to say that they want to develop this land, you would be eligible for this project type. And what would happen is that your business as usual scenario would actually be set to 0. So as long as you continue sustainable forest management, you as the landowner would be paid for all of the carbon credits on the landscape, as long as you continue sustainable forest management and retain those trees there. Over time, that could be translated into a improved forest management project. The last major project is reforestation, and this is simply planting trees on land that has been cleared for more than 10 years. They have the 10 years project in there specifically because we can't clear cut a property and then replant it and call it a reforestation project. But this is really helpful for degraded lands across the country. So the baseline here, just like an avoided conversion project, is 0. So all the managed above ground carbon counts as additional carbon removals. And then they can be managed over time for harvesting as necessary and managed as an improved forest management project. So next I'm going to talk about the protocols, and the protocols really help define all these different management practices and how the credits are developed and sold on the market. So we talked about the compliance market, and the compliance market is has a couple protocols. All of these protocols we just discussed through the management, they're basically these 3: improved forest management, afforestation, reforestation, and avoided conversion. So there's a couple tenets. You have payments for the sequestered carbon every 6 years after verification. So the project developer would make sure that that happens every 6 years as dictated by the California Air Resources Board. Because this is in the compliance market and they have quite stringent verification, these do often result in higher offset prices when sold on the compliance market auction. These project types do have a greater contribution to natural climate solutions and co-benefits. They are 100-year easement projects, so they require that the land be set aside for this project for at least 100 years. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that management can occur. We're not just leaving it there and letting it go for 100 years, but it does restrict the ability for any sort of development or changing changing large management objectives over that time period. Because of this, it is often ideal for large land holdings. So typically we see this in greater than 5,000 acres, but that doesn't mean that it is impossible to do in smaller areas. The voluntary market is very similar. You have what's called the Verified Carbon Standard and the American Carbon Registry who initiate these other protocols, and they have a protocol for about every single management practice that we've discussed. So we'd have extension of rotation age, conversion of low productive to high productive forest, avoided ecosystem conversion, log to protected forest, etc. We also have the methodology for avoided forest degradation through fire, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Within the voluntary market, there are more project types. They also have allowed for shorter easement and project time periods. So we still have some permanence through a 40 or a 30 to 40 to 50 year project. But this also helps increase the landowner participation and ultimately the offset credits. Because of these flexibilities that have been employed in the voluntary market, there is typically a greater variability in the offset price. Though, as I mentioned before, we do expect that this market is going to grow and the prices will increase significantly in the next 5 to 10 years. So last but not least in this hierarchy is the registries. And the registries are essentially these nonprofit organizations that are helping to manage the carbon market itself. They're the ones that issue the credits and ultimately provide the framework for buying and selling the credits from the carbon project developers to the corporations who are interested in purchasing them. So they also develop the protocols that are implemented by these carbon project developers. So they're the ones that are providing guidance for the management of additionality, and they ultimately determine and defend the credibility of the carbon credits. So as you may have seen with the voluntary market, we see that the verified carbon standard is about 50 to 60%, we saw recently, in terms of the amount of credits sold worldwide. They're taking quite a bit of that. The Climate Action Reserve is based out of Los Angeles, and they are doing the compliance market for the California Air Resources Board. And then the American Carbon Registry, one of the oldest registries, has about 5% of the credits. So they're a bit smaller, but also here in the United States. The gold standard, CDM, are international standards that are used in deforestation projects primarily worldwide. So I'm going to go over a little bit of a pathway to generating carbon credits. So this is important for not only landowners, but understanding for the general public, for those credit buyers to understand really how are these projects developed, and also to know that when these projects are developed, they are following important standards. They're following a process that will actually make sure through a variety of third parties that these credits are actually additional and permanent and verified. So we're going to start at the very beginning of looking at a property, for example, and we're going to see whether this property is feasible or not for a carbon project. And feasibility is going to determine a variety of different factors, landowner willingness, previous harvest, and then also additionality and permanence. After that's been determined, project developers will cruise the forest and determine that protocol to follow. So once it's listed on the registry, they will quantify the sequestration baseline and project the future sequestration. At this point, both the project developer and the landowner will have a general idea of how much carbon will be sequestered over the life of the project, not necessarily accounting for any disturbances, but they would understand based on their management goals, how many carbon offset credits they would be able to obtain over the life of this project. After that, the third party would come in and they would verify these stocks, projected sequestration, both on the ground verification and a desk review of all this data. They would send that data to the registry, so that may be the Climate Action Reserve or Vera. They would review to make sure the credits are real, additional, permanent, and verifiable. And then ultimately that registry would issue those credits to be traded on the offset market. This process does take a significant amount of time. It takes about 18 to 24 months to actually implement these projects, just because of a lot of work to make sure that they are verified and that the carbon is actually retained on the landscape based on the projected management goals. So it does take a while, but we are seeing more projects come online in the last 5 years. So that was our year one. That was how a project actually starts up. But again, as I mentioned, for a lot of these projects, it's coming back every 5, 10, year 5, 10, 15, 20, and through the life of the project to actually assess the management that's being done and then measure the additional carbon on the landscape. So when it comes to year 5, for example, the project developers are going to go back out into the forest and they're going to assess the management outcomes. Did the management actually occur like it was said it was done, whether that be harvesting or brush removal? And then what is that additional carbon that was sequestered on the landscape? The third party is going to verify all that. The registry is going to review all of that stuff again. And then those additional credits will be issued and traded on the offset market. And this process would take about 6 to 12 months every 5 years. So this is a really busy table that's really just showing that there's a lot of different options when it comes to picking a protocol. And it's helpful to know that the project developers, if you're a landowner, project developers are going to understand all of these different options. And there's oftentimes corporations are going to have an interest in certain protocols as well, based on their ability to withstand societal pressure and making sure that the additionality and permanence are being employed. Just one thing to note here is you have the Climate Action Reserve and you have different factors: project length, wear, management, upfront costs. All these things are going to vary among the different protocols. But the project developer would help you as a landowner or help a corporation understand what is the best way to maximize carbon, but also reduce costs as well based on different protocols. So I'm going to finish up here with the future of carbon markets, some ongoing research. So to help us understand a little bit more about where these credits are going, who's purchasing them, we have to understand that the evolution of this net zero goal through things like BlackRock back in 2020, 2021, BlackRock came out and said that they were going to be, investing in sustainable infrastructure and sustainable financial goals. And what that says is that they're going to have to achieve net zero, or other organizations are going to have to achieve this net zero emissions over a certain time frame. But that's not always possible right away. Offset credits provide that mechanism for organizations to actually become net zero when somebody else is reducing the emissions for them. But what we're seeing here is the evolution of this thing called science-based targets, where organizations can't use 100% of their emissions as offset credits. They can only use offset credits for what we call residual emissions, or very hard to abate emissions. So because of this, we see number one here, less credits are being allocated to each company. But at the same time, more companies are making net zero commitments worldwide. So what we're seeing here long-term is that the requirement of high quality offset credits to mitigate residual emissions is not going to go away. It's only going to increase. So this is why right now we're only, from a carbon credit market, we're only sufficing about 11% of the market demand. And we expect that there will be a significant demand for carbon credits over the next 20 to 30 years because of this trend. Additionally, as Taylor mentioned, is that we want to be able to capture all of the ecosystem services that are produced in these forested ecosystems. So a lot of times in some ecosystems, we may see a trade-off between carbon and ecosystem services. If we're maximizing carbon, we might not actually be maximizing wildlife habitat or biodiversity. And this idea of payments for ecosystem services is gaining traction, where we're actually going to help provide funding through conservation financing to landowners so they can maximize all of the ecosystem services on their landscape. And a lot of this has to do with modeling and baselining and understanding more about how these ecosystems function, and then also communicating that back to corporates who are interested in ecosystem preservation in the long term. So we're hoping to, through things like biodiversity credits, and then also the valuation of different types of carbon credits. We saw that with avoidance versus removals versus nature-based. Corporations are starting to see that there is a value to the co-benefits and the ecosystem services that are being obtained from these credits. So as that becomes more prevalent, we do expect that these credits, again, we're going to actually increase in price because they see that there is additional value beyond carbon being derived in these ecosystems. And as I mentioned before, we did see a pretty significant increase in the carbon credit prices in 2021, but in the late 2022 to the present, there has been a global downturn in prices. And there's a couple reasons for this. And internationally, the downturn is because of the restricting of the sale and export of credits in Indonesia from a government standpoint, the restructuring of these deforestation protocols, the Clean Development Mechanism, and the deforestation protocol called REDD+. And then there's also been some scrutiny from journalists, large stakeholders, making sure that these credits and the principles and the standards will actually create high quality credits, so actual emissions reductions, which is really important for the long-term viability of this of carbon markets. So the downturn has been difficult when it comes to prices, but in the long term, it will be really beneficial to make sure that this market is stable for the long term. When we think about increasing prices, like we said, I do expect this to increase significantly in the next 10 years. Number one, this new program called CORSIA is going to require many airlines to purchase credits to offset their emissions by 2026. So the likes of Delta, American, United, all of these large airlines have committed to purchasing CORSIA credits so that they will offset their emissions starting in 2026, which will increase demand significantly. We also have new project types coming online. So we have blue carbon and coastal ecosystems, biochar, carbon dioxide removal. All of these different types of projects beyond forestry are going to contribute to helping alleviate this demand, but also going to provide competition and increase these prices. For forestry projects, the digital tools for measurement and verification are going to become really important, and they're going to also help scale these projects. So using things like satellites and LiDAR and drones and aircraft to measure carbon from the air and develop these projects quicker is going to help scale in the long term and also protect these forests for the long term. And then most recently, I've heard some numbers from some large organizations that have said that this market is on track to be $1 trillion market by 2031. So the development of these principles and standards is really important to making sure that this market can have integrity and actually reach this goal so that both landowners and corporates can achieve the goals that they would like to through this market. So I'm going to go over a couple FAQs and then I will take any questions. When it comes to eligibility, knowing how, whether you're a corporation or whether you're a landowner, it's important to know that if you're not under a restrictive management easement, you could be eligible for some or all of carbon market protocols. So if you have forest land, it must allow for harvesting or conversion, because this is how we get that additionality and using the funds to manage that land over time. Also, prescribed fire is really important in a lot of ecosystems. If it's included in the initial carbon accounting, prescribed fire can be utilized. And this is important because this is a mechanism to reduce the potential for large crown fires. And I'm going to talk a little bit here too about this new protocol coming out that's focusing on avoided wildfire, which is going to be really important for our California ecosystems. But avoided wildfire is a new protocol from the Climate Action Reserve that manages forests to reduce the potential for wildfire. So the additionality is utilizing the funding to secure more brush removal and provide healthy forest management. So if we're looking at this graph, it's a little busy, but what we can see here is that on the top of the graph in the sky is carbon emissions. On the bottom of the graph is carbon sequestration. And over time, in the blue lines, you'll see that there is, in a typical forest, you'll have continual carbon sequestration over time in that blue line, and will continue to sequester carbon if it is managed healthily. There may be a little bit of respiration occurring, but very limited if it is managed in a healthy way. But if we allow fire to enter the ecosystem, what's going to happen is that we're going to increase our emissions from this fire event that would occur right here. We're also going to lose the potential for carbon sequestration over time, because that forest has now been removed, has died. And so reducing the potential for wildfire is really important from a carbon sequestration potential, because we're losing the two mechanisms. We're losing carbon in the fire. We're also losing the potential for carbon sequestration over time. So put that into words, we see that it provides the funding for additional forest management, reduces the chances of burning the carbon that it currently exists, and also helps keep forests as forests so they can sequester carbon well into the future. So this protocol hasn't been implemented yet in California or elsewhere, but we do expect that this will be a key way that, if corporations will be willing to purchase these credits, will be a key way to help increase that conservation financing into these forests that desperately need additional management to reduce wildfire. So if you're a landowner, you may be asking this question: how valuable really is your forest to the carbon market? And it really goes back to that idea of additionality, and how much additionality can you create or manage for. So the more carbon you can store on the landscape, additional to what you've been doing, is how you're going to increase the value. So because avoided conversion sets the baseline to 0, that's going to be your maximum carbon sequestration. But over time, increasing stocking, increasing thinning and management for high carbon species, and then also avoiding wildfire, pairing it with an IFM or an improved forest management project could be super valuable. And then also land size is really important when it comes to impacting the carbon market revenue. Also, when it comes to the length of project, I mentioned this with permanence a little bit. The length of the project is going to help with investor confidence, making sure that that carbon is staying out of the atmosphere. And then how are you paid? So there are a couple different ways that you are paid for these projects, and it really depends on who is purchasing these credits and the project developer that you would be working with. But the landowner could receive upfront payments once they have a guaranteed buyer. So they may be guaranteed a certain price per acre per year. This payment could be reevaluated every 10 years, 8 to 10 years, depending on the price of carbon credits. And this project model really is becoming more common. The other model is after these credits are retired. So this is a little riskier for the landowner, but what would happen is that once the credits are retired and sold to an organizations, the landowner would typically receive about 60 to 70% of what the credits were sold for on the market, and the developer and the other entities would receive the rest of that revenue to pay for the project itself. So what we're seeing now, just when you see some current prices, the Q2 compliance market auction closed at around $56 a ton. and then which was up from around 25 to 30 in Q4 of 2022. And then the voluntary market, you saw maybe on that graph before, the nature-based credits were very low, but this is rebounding to $5 to $15 a ton. And your project developer, if you're a landowner, is going to actually help optimize this over time to make sure you get the best sale and get the best revenue. But again, these numbers are expected to increase over time. So last but not least, I just want to talk a little bit about how these projects provide value. And we know that these projects are rapidly expanding and evolving, and the market-based management of carbon and ecosystem services is not going to go away soon. So there's four major things, one being replanting and conserving forests. This is one new mechanism that's going to help protect forests, but also have long-term timber stores. This is channeling funding to healthy forest management, especially when there's limited sources of either governmental or nonprofit funding. It increases stakeholder awareness of climate change mitigation, long-term sustainable forestry, and ultimately provides a mechanism for that corporate involvement in sustainability and conservation if desired, helping to bring these connections together so that we can really make strides when it comes to biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation. And you'll just see here on the right, this is a map that shows all the different projects in California. A lot of these green ones are improved forest management projects in the Sierra and Northern California. And then we also have agriculture soil projects in the orange throughout Central Valley there. But that is it from me, and I'm happy to take additional questions.
All right, just getting set back up here. That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Lucas, for joining us today and sharing the relevant and timely information. So right now, we actually had quite a few questions already in the chat, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. I would like to invite our participants to contribute to Sierra Nevada Alliance and to help keep these monthly webinars free and accessible to all. So to do that, you can visit sierranevadaalliance.org/donate to help protect the Sierra now and for the future. And that website will be in the chat. Let's see. I see Barbara has a hand up, so we could, did you have a specific question that you didn't put in the chat?
Hi, is that Barbara Ravines?
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for this. It's fascinating. I wondered if he can tell us who are most of the owners of, or who are the subscribers to these credits. What is the category? Is it oil companies? It's airlines I saw, but what about large corporations? What are those, if there is that possible?
For sure, yeah. This, being the fact that it's a voluntary market, nationally, we see a lot of our tech companies. Oil and gas is definitely one, but also commodity traders. So they're purchasing credits and starting to look at this as trading commodities. So we do see that anybody that's getting into this net zero market, which is typically our largest corporations, all the way from manufacturing, BMW, Volvo, those type of things are also purchasing credits. So those are the biggest ones, but then the voluntary market is also available for even individuals if they would like to offset their credits as well, though that's not nearly as common.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna get into the list of questions we have so far. First up is, can you explain the dip for nature-based credits?
Yeah, so that goes back to really it goes back to this the redevelopment of some of these protocols. There's some articles that came out that discussed some of issues with some of the deforestation protocols, and that's really why we saw a dip in the price that some investors were pulling back and they didn't want to purchase these credits yet. But there's been as these new principles are coming out from international organizations, reinstating and reinforcing these ideas of additionality and permanence and verification, the credit prices are starting to go back up.
Next up is, does the measurement and verification timeline mean that most landowners can expect to get paid / sell their credits at the 5 to 6 year mark?
The short answer there is yes. Typically that what we would see is that once those credits are sold on the market at that time, then you would receive the credits, could be sold, and you would get the revenue. The only time that wouldn't happen is if there was some sort of agreement with the project developer where you would be paid each year for the potential for those credits, but that means that that project developer is taking on the risk of that project and not the landowner. So that could be beneficial, but that's not as common as just waiting the 5 to 6 years until the credits are verified.
Would fire mitigation activities such as cultural burning count as part of a buffer pool? I know California Climate Reserve is working on quantification.
So it kind of goes back to this idea that prescribed fire can be utilized as a management practice. So as long as that's accounted for and done in a sustainable way, then yes, it can. Those types of things can be utilized. Yeah.
May I ask an additional kind of thing on that? Thanks, and that'll hopefully answer one of my other questions as well. So cultural burning by indigenous groups is different from prescribed burning for many reasons, and that it can actually sequester more carbon. It does not use accelerants, which is actually really ideal for riparian areas, as well as burning at cooler temperatures, which actually produces more biochar and sequesters more carbon. Like I said, I know that these protocols are different. I don't know whether or not the carbon market industry in general is making that distinction, or if there's room to make that distinction.
That's a great question. Yeah, at this point, there's not that distinction. But there's also not anything that says, well, I guess what I should say is when it comes to measuring the carbon on the landscape, we're measuring above ground and below ground carbon. So we're not going to measure, typically not measuring the carbon that's obtained through biochar or even the brush carbon that would or would not be burned. So it's going to help with healthy forest management, but it's not going to be accounted for in the protocol. So either way, it's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is avoided conversion accompanied by a mechanism such as a conservation easement?
It can be, yes. So depending on the protocol, if it's compliance or voluntary, it could be accompanied with a easement, though not necessarily, but all of these projects do have legally binding, they go with the land, for example. So there would be some encumbrances placed through the project itself.
Okay, this is kind of a multi-question question. How can biomass utilization facilities qualify and quantify carbon offsets? This would be huge for funding, processing, and utilization facilities, which is so difficult to do right now and so necessary. And then second, and if our biomass plants produce biochar and we already have claimed credits there, does this pathway allow for additional credits, or have we already accounted for this work in our biochar credits?
And a lot of that is coming. So it hasn't, there's some, the market's really fragmented in the sense of like, there's a lot of different startups and entities that are developing these protocols. And I think this is really important right now. Biochar is going to be an important carbon credit. They're already being sold in private instances, but what we don't really have a good standardized framework for either of these things. So it's kind of hard to answer, but I do see credits coming out of that in the future. Yes.
How can one submit data to develop new protocols for non-conventional solutions such as indigenous stewardship?
So a lot of times, working with these registries, so whether it be VERA or the Climate Action Reserve, allow for the submission of new protocols. So for example, at Clemson University, we're working on protocol development to help landowners with wood products, for example. So they do allow for the development of these protocols. Most of the protocols have been developed by consultants already. So the only thing is that it has to work within the framework
Only put this,
of
I didn't see it there.
these the basic tenets of additionality and permanence to make sure that the credits are can be quantified and have a real climate impact, if that makes sense.
Okay, will there be biochar variables in the avoided wildfire for activities like cultural burning? I think that was the one that she was talking about. Had answered her question there. Let's see, can smaller land size... Oop, is someone trying to say something? Okay. Can smaller land sizes such as easements be bundled into a larger aggregate for credit eligibility?
So the short answer is yes. We can have small landowners can come together through different ownerships, and we can have one large project. This has been actually difficult to practically implement on the ground. There hasn't been many projects like this, simply because it is hard to come to terms for how the management will occur over the lifetime of the project, since they are so long. So we haven't seen a good examples, but the protocols do allow for it.
Just a couple more. Can these credits be applied to biomass facilities as a revenue stream? And what are the general price ranges for those credits?
A good question. They can be, right now, these credits are they can be applied as offsets, but those for biochar, if I'm understanding correctly, those would be separate development and wouldn't fall under these protocols that I discussed today. Price wise, it's still too soon to tell on the biochar. I think as I mentioned, there's some being sold privately, but because it's voluntary, there's not a lot of data out there, so I'm not sure.
And last, can you share your perspective on the forces underlying, they said, observed paucity of projects in Central Southern Sierra?
Yeah. So the biggest thing I think will be important is being able to channel this, channeling funding to as I mentioned with the avoided wildfire, I think that'll be really important, but being able to aggregate, being able to implement this onto public lands as well. Right now, a lot of this is specifically for private lands. It works really well in the Southeast because there's so much private land. But being able to value not only the carbon, but the long-term viability of these forests, because they're being affected by drought, by disease, by poor management in the past. All of these things will come into play as we see corporates understand better that these are all important factors that relate to long-term sustainability. So as more funding, I guess more funders recognize these things, I think that's going to help push these projects forward, and there will be other co-benefits for the corporates to achieve not only carbon offset credits, but maybe just understanding that biodiversity and healthy forest management is an important part of their business model as well, if that helps.
One more popped up. Is there additional value in terms of ecosystem services of working forest conservation easements that contain protocols for enhancing habitat, biodiversity, and headwaters protection? And if so, can that additional value be channeled to landowners who are managing the whole range of ecosystem services?
Yeah, great question. So the short answer is yes, whether we look at it from an intrinsic value or we look at it from an economic scenario, there's a lot of science that says that there is an additional value for these ecosystem services that private and public landowners are managing. And being able to translate this from a residential value to a corporate value is probably the most difficult piece, which is why new protocols are really going to help provide that framework for those entities to understand how that value can be translated to them as a corporation. So, and if the protocols are there, that's going to help incentivize the landowners to continue or increase management for all of the ecosystem services as well. So we do hope that that will be really where this market goes, even though carbon offsetting is still really important from a greenhouse gas management perspective.
Okay. I think that is the end of our questions, but before you sign off, Annika is going to drop a link for you to give some feedback about today's presentation so we can provide the best content for you in the future. And I'm going to turn it back over to Taylor to wrap up the webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and sharing in my own curiosity, learning about this. You know, Lucas shared that this is currently a $2 billion market, and it's within less than 10 years, it's expected to be $1 trillion market. I think that right there is just enough to give us all pause and question and have some questions about the things that we're working on and maybe put a different paradigm on some of the things that we're working with. Also, I think I'm going to advocate for Lucas a little bit. He has been just such a remarkable resource for me, and I just have enjoyed all of the conversations that I've had with Lucas, and he has his own consulting firm as well. And so I don't know if you want me to put it out there, Lucas, but I do know that this man loves talking about this stuff, and he can explain it to your team well. So I'll also say that beyond being just so technically competent, Lucas and I have had so many conversations about the ethics of this industry and the morality of what it means to be a practitioner with this. So he brings such a wholehearted approach to his own work and is really looking out for the best of all of his projects from a comprehensive standpoint. So thank you. We're going to provide Lucas's contact information and follow-up emails. Please feel free to reach out to him or to me. I'm looking to expand my understanding of not just carbon, but ecosystem services as well. And I would love to have conversations with everyone on this call too. Our next webinar is on August 7th, and we have Vanessa Munoz, Conservation Program Manager with Hispanic Access Foundation. She's presenting on the Nature Gap, Confronting Racial and Economic Disparities in America. Please check SierraNevadaAlliance.org/events to register. And again, thank you, Lucas. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us.